we start with a substantive discussion, I'm very happy to announce that we will have a performance by the UN Symphony Orchestra. It is my great pleasure to introduce Predrag Vasic, who is the founder and the music director of the orchestra. Predrag is a colleague from the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. He's also a professional musician. He has worked with several major orchestras in the former Yugoslavia, including Belgrade Philharmonic, Symphony Orchestra of the Serbian Radio and TV, and Zagreb Philharmonics, as a conductor, as an orchestrator, and as an arranger. Predrag, you have the floor for a few minutes if you want to introduce the piece that will be performed. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. Good morning. It is a great pleasure and indeed an honor for me and for us, the orchestra, to take part in our own way in this global forum on gender statistics. On behalf of our dedicated musicians, I would like to thank the organizers, the government of Switzerland, of course, my department, statistics office of the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, for giving us the opportunity to perform today. The tragic global pandemic that has ravaged our world has deeply affected all our work at the UN, and this certainly includes our work in this orchestra. We have kept it together, ironically, by working separately through our individual video contributions, which we have combined into a unified performance for special events like this one today. In a fitting tribute to the theme of this forum, we are now pleased to perform the music of Florence Price, who was the first African-American woman to be recognized as a symphonic composer and the first woman to have her work performed by a major orchestra in the US. Today, we will perform an uplifting movement from her suite, Dances in the Canebrakes, a welcome reminder of our common humanity in difficult times. We hope that this music by a path-breaking woman composer will be followed by many years of positive statistical trends to advance the health, safety, welfare, and fundamental rights of women everywhere. So, let the music and this welcome process now begin. Thank you.
Predrag, and dear colleagues, I'm impressed and speechless. Honestly, it was fantastic. I just want to remind the audience that these are UN colleagues or former colleagues. So in addition to being experts in their own areas, being IT, being statistics, being legal affairs, political affairs, these are fantastic musicians. Again, I'm speechless.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you
some of
so
these,
much.
and some of your colleagues may have noticed, some of the participants here may have noticed one of our musicians is actually a
Yes.
statistician, former
Yes.
statistician, Keiko.
Yes,
She was
thank you.
down at the bottom in the cello section.
We saw her. Thank you, Keiko, for being with us. Thanks, Predrag. Thanks. This was really, really a great surprise. Thank you so much for being with us.
It has been a pleasure.
So let's move on with our discussion this morning. Of course, I will need a couple of minutes just to refine balance. It was really impressive and I'm a little emotional. But we have an important discussion this morning because we are going to move into session 4, where we will discuss how to build forward better and how to use gender statistics to guide the recovery and the SDGs decade of action. I'm very happy to introduce our expert panelists. I'll go first around the table. So I would like to invite the speakers for session 4 to turn on their videos. So the first one is Maria Isabel Cobos Hernandez, who is currently a colleague of mine. She works on gender, social, and migration statistics at the UN Statistics Division. We also have Osama Marcelli, who is the Director of Statistics at the High Commission for Planning of Morocco. We have Alison Bryant, who leads the research center and heads up the technology impact area for ARP. We have also Antonietta Mira, who is a professor of statistics and the founder and director of the Data Science Lab at the University della Svizzera Italiana in Lugano, Switzerland. And finally, we are very pleased to have with us Ms. Eva Biaudet, who is a well-known human rights activist and the former Minister of Health and Social Services of Finland, also responsible for gender equality issues. As of May 2019, Eva started her 6th term in the Finnish Parliament. She is currently a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Grant Committee. Thank you all for being with us. Moving into the discussion, I have prepared a few questions for you. I hope that all your videos are on. Let me start with Maria Isabel. Maria Isabel, as a senior statistician at the United Nations, what can you tell us about data on intersecting inequalities? Why are they important? And do we have this type of information at the global level? Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca, for that question. I would like to center my discussion today into the importance and the power of having granular data. Granular data helps us make sense of an entangled reality, of entangled situations. All of us have different factors working to our advantage or to our disadvantage, and these different factors overlap with each other, creating inequalities. So the granular data is really the fuel to realize the 2030 agenda. And to illustrate this point, if I can have a couple of examples in my slides, please. I'm bringing data from the US. And for example, look how wrong we would be if we only would look at the total unemployment rate, which stands at 8%. When we are able to drill down, it's possible to see the gaps, not only between women and men, but also for particular population groups. In this instance, we are looking at the interaction between sex, citizenship, and education in the US. And almost in all cases, women's unemployment is higher than the average. And that's particularly the case for women that are not citizens of the US. So this, even for the most advanced education group, this is the case for women that are not citizens of the US. Another angle that I'm showing at the right-hand side is the monthly earning for employees. And we can see by disaggregating by citizenship status that we are able to uncover, and not only uncover, but quantify the gap that are present between women and men and between citizens and not citizens. They're pointing us to the fact that migrant women are worse off in terms of labor market inclusion. I have also another example that I'm taking from our flagship publication, The World's Women 2020. This was contributed by Brazil, and it's looking at the population not in employment, education, or training, NEET. And again, the total average, which is almost 1 in 4, hides very stark inequalities between women and men, and even higher rates are recorded for women of color. So when we take another slice at the data, we see now the interaction clearly between sex and ethnicity. In this case, women of color are the most affected group, even more than white women, and almost double, or actually double, than white men. Lastly, another example that I'm also taking from the World's Women 2020, this was contributed by our colleagues from ECLAC. They were able to pull together data from 6 countries on hourly income. And thanks to this granular data, we are able to distinctly see just how disadvantaged indigenous women are in these countries. Here we have not only sex and ethnicity, but we also have years of schooling. And this allows us to drill down into these overlapping inequalities. Indigenous women earned less than women and men of other ethnicities, regardless of their educational level. So now, touching upon the second part of your question, are we able to do this kind of analysis, which is not so much sophisticated, is pretty basic descriptive statistics. Are we able to do this for all countries, or at the regional level, at sub-regional level, let alone at global level? The short answer is no, or at least not yet. Can I have my next slide? The good news, there is good news here, is that we have much more data than was being produced and made available about 25 years ago. For instance, looking at our publication, The World's Women, we have tenfold number of data points comparing 1995 to last year, 2020. So we need to recognize that there has been tremendous progress in this increased availability, and this is mainly due to the availability of these aggregations, mainly by age groups. But to be able to inform policy, this is simply not enough. There are persistent gaps in important areas that hamper well-thought and well-designed policy process. And to illustrate this point, I have my next slide, and I promise this the last. Without going into details, it is evident that there are still gaps in indicators that are important, but we have very few data points. So this is concluding that much more needs to be done to identify, and not only to identify, but to quantify the interplay that exists between gender and other factors that ultimately result in wasted human capital that we can simply not afford. Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you so much, Maria Isabel. Of course, we all agree on the importance of measuring and monitoring intersecting inequalities from a gender lens. I like the examples that you picked, looking at migration angle, looking at ethnicity, and also highlighting the power of further disaggregating data, further slicing the data. I think that's your keyword, to make sure that we highlight overlapping inequalities. And I also like the fact that you pointed to the lack of data, and hopefully as we go through the discussion, we'll come up with some recommendations on what needs to be done to improve the situation. Talking about migration, or keeping the discussion on migration and gender, I like to move to Sama. So moving to migration as a specific intersection with gender, Sama, as a leader in the National Statistical Office in Morocco, can you share your experience in collecting data on these topics, including during COVID? Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. First, I would like to thank and to congratulate UNSD and the Swiss Confederates for organizing the highly successful 8th Global Forum, Gender Statistics, with the guidance of the Interagency Expert Group on Gender Statistics. On behalf of the High Commission for Planning of Morocco, I would like also to thank you for inviting me among eminent panelists to debate gender statistics mapping inequalities. For tackling migration, allow me to note that Morocco conducted on 2018 with support of UN agencies a mapping of gender SDG data gaps while considering cross-cutting aspects through national consultations process involving all stakeholders, both producers and users. In order to address gender data gaps, several gender surveys are regularly conducted in Morocco, as Violence Against Women survey, which estimated the cost of violence against women, as well as Time Use survey. Also, in other surveys, gender-related topics are being included. Madam Chair, as you know, Morocco is a country of migrant sending, receiving, and transit. It is committed to play a responsible and positive role with regards to international migration issues at the regional and the global level. To this end, Morocco hosted the Intergovernmental Conference on the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration on Marrakesh in 2018, and is currently hosting African Observatory for Migration and Development, which is an African Union institution. Morocco, as you know, conducted the MED-HIMS, which is a household survey on international migration, looking into immigrants, return migrants, and forced migrants. This survey is harmonized across several South Mediterranean countries to provide comparable data.
Usama, I lost you. Maybe you muted yourself?
No, I haven't. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. Thank you. Sorry about that. Talking about the HIMS, which is the International Migration Survey, topics that were included were decisions, migration profiles, drivers and factors, networks, itineraries, integration, remittances, and their uses. Specific questions related to migration are also considered in many other data sources, such as censuses, labor force survey, and administrative registers. With regard to COVID-19 crisis, Morocco conducted several surveys to assess the pandemic impact on the population and on the economy, be it formal and informal, with special focus on vulnerable groups such as women, migrants, refugees, and children. Given the lockdown constraints on population movements, phone and computer apps were used to conduct the surveys. Objectives of the underlying surveys were first to understand the changes in the behaviors of population, as well as social and gender relations and different roles during the COVID-19 pandemic. Also to assess the differentiated and specific effects of the impact with gender lens. To measure access to basic goods and services such as education, healthcare, and health safety, and to measure changes in employment, income, and living conditions. As an outcome of these surveys, HCP timely released several reports and also published a dedicated gender analysis of COVID-19 impact, which were broadly used by all stakeholders and users. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Usama. Of course, I take note of the powerful household survey, dedicated survey that you run on international migration. I think that's excellent to really grasp the many dimensions of international migration from all the important points that you mentioned, also for the specific overlapping vulnerabilities for women and for other subgroups. I also like the fact that this type of surveys really allow you to better understand the drivers and the reasons behind these people moving internationally. So I look forward to also look at the analysis of those data, the results of the survey from a gender perspective. I also take note of the survey on COVID. I believe we have already seen some of the results, and it would be great to be able to broadcast the results widely so that other countries can also maybe build upon what has been achieved in terms of tools used in Morocco. Thank you so much. I think we can move to our third presenter. Going on with our discussion on intersecting inequalities, I'm happy to Alison. Alison, your organization specializes in older adults. What is unique in terms of issues around data on older women? And what are the data needs and gaps to inform these issues? Thank you, Alison.
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much for having me with you this morning here in DC. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the unique experiences of older women, but I do want to focus on sort of where does that leave us from a data gap perspective. So just thinking a little bit demographically, you're thinking about older women, we have longer lives. That's 5 additional years in the US or 7 years globally right now. So we're dealing even with making sure that we are focusing on women for a longer amount of time and different experiences, whether it's in work or in health. So from a work perspective, we know that women's work lives are often less linear due to time off for childbearing or child rearing. It could be extended longer, which I can talk about in just a second, because they are living longer lives and have different kinds of financial needs. So in the US, for example, we know that women over 45 right now make up about almost 44% of the workforce. That was 2016 numbers, but the projections are that by 2024, there's going to be twice as many women over 55 than women 16 to 24 in the workforce. So it's a very large segment of the workforce that we need to be, having more focus on. They also have additional financial burdens because they are living longer lives and they have this nonlinear work or that they're caregiving. So right now, about 60% of caregivers are women, and they tend to be women over 50 as well. So that has a different kind of impact. And then, I mentioned unique health issues. Many of the unique health issues of older women are typically, they're understudied compared to other issues, and they're often not discussed. And I think the one that I often like to bring up is menopause. So here's an issue where you have half of the population experiencing it at some point in time, but it's, first of all, basically a medical mystery in a lot of respects. And it's typically not discussed, and certainly not discussed as an independent variable, intersecting with other issues. A lot of focus has been on childbearing, and there's a lot of good reason for that. But, menopause or perimenopause can last 7 to 14 years in a woman's life, and it can have a significant effect on health and on quality of life. And in fact, 3/4 of symptomatic menopausal women talk about that having serious problems in dealing with the physical or mental demands of work. Or they might have prolonged sickness and absence for work. So that's a great example of, have you seen a lot of, long-term or deep dive workforce data that actually includes menopause as an independent variable? Not typically, right? It's not something we like to talk about, but it does have impacts on those issues. So all of that for me and for us really makes us think about a few different data gaps. So one is going to be around, of course, collection of data that have unique experiences. So I mentioned menopause is an interesting one, or even things like leaving out groups when we collect data, like women over the age of 80, often left out when people are focusing on issues, whether it's work or health. And so that's going to be a really critical issue. Also looking at intersectionalities, like the experience of single grandmothers, for example, who are often primary caregivers of grandchildren. That's a rising cohort in the US, and very little focus on what might be their unique needs. Again, so we're not talking about the middle here. We're talking about looking at the data on the edges, or the experiences on the edges. And then I'd say also for us, when we think about older women, specific topics like policies that affect assisted living facilities. So if you think about those are going to be spaces where you do have majority older women, and there are unique issues, or even collecting data there could be a unique data gap that we have, or specific topics like social isolation, which would be something that would increase dramatically with age and in that particular setting. So I think all of those are things, again, looking at those edges, but those are groups that have not only unique experiences, but may be more at risk or have more needs, be much more underserved.
Thank you, Alison. I'm just trying to process everything you are saying. It's all super important. I mean, I love the idea that looking at the older people as a group, you are really trying to unpack and coming up with maybe at the beginning of the group, those that enter into menopause, and then focusing also to those that go much beyond, or the 80 plus women, and then a group of potential vulnerable people. So I like that perspective. Of course, I'm all with you when you highlight the data gaps on women in menopause and what it means. I belong to that group, so I would love to have more research to help me. Yes, I look forward to seeing what happens in the next round of questions. Thank you so much. Moving to Antonietta. Antonietta, I hope you are with us, and you can open, switch on your video. You represent the academia and researchers community in this panel this morning, and you have done extensive research with COVID-related data. In this regard, what have we learned from the pandemic? Thanks, Antonietta.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to this interesting global forum. With a multidisciplinary and international team, we have done research related to COVID, focusing on various aspects, from statistical models aimed at predicting the course of the pandemic and the effect of non-pharmaceutical intervention, all the way to models to help manage emergency room and emergency calls. I have to report that in most countries, there was a general lack of publicly available data disaggregated by sex and age, especially in the first phase of the pandemic. Of course, with time, more disaggregated data from hospitals, nursing homes, and other private sources became available through restricted research groups. And with this data, it also became clear that sex and gender differences impact the incidence of SARS-CoV-2 and the mortality by COVID-19. Gender can also influence risk behavior, possibly impacting the course of the infection. And both sex and gender can furthermore influence the pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamics, and the safety profile of drugs, including side effects. There is an increased report of long COVID symptoms in women, and the pandemic is affecting women's mental health and emotional health, not to mention economic and social consequences. Furthermore, previous influenza vaccine research suggests that women can produce the same immunological response to half-dose vaccine as men do to full dose. And indeed, also for COVID vaccine, there is data suggesting the need for sex-differentiated vaccine dosing regimes. So given these potential health risks for a large fraction of the population, in a paper published in Nature in July 2021 by researchers from Denmark, Netherlands, and Germany, approximately 4,500 registered SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-related studies have been analyzed over a one-year period starting January 2020. Well, it emerges that 21% of these studies address sex and gender only in the recruitment phase, and only 4% explicitly report a plan to include sex and gender as a variable. The majority of the studies, approximately 67%, make no mention of sex and gender. Just 8 of the 45 COVID-19 related clinical trials published in scientific journals until December 2020 report sex disaggregated results or subgroup analysis. Several calls urging the inclusion of sex and gender into COVID-19 trials have been published. So we learned that excluding one sex from trials and not disaggregating results by sex can lead to an increased incidence of unwanted side effects in the untested population. Not addressing the gender dimension hampers the opportunity to reduce inequality in healthcare, to produce preventive actions, and to modulate the course of the infection on pharmacological access. To conclude, we have learned that sex appears to be an important determinant of many aspects related to COVID-19. Still, currently registered clinical trials mostly omit sex and as an explicit recruitment or analytical criterion. And thinking beyond the pandemic, personal data, notably health-related data, is still not collected by default with the sex dimension. Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you, Antonietta. That's quite scary what you tell us, that, clinical trials, the results of clinical trials are not really, the results are not disaggregated by sex. They're not, the analysis by sex is not visible. I think that's something that should absolutely be addressed. And I'm all for you that we need to promote the disaggregation by sex. I would even say by age, sex and age. There is definitely an age effect also per default. So I'm all with you. Let's go on with the discussion and see how we can get back to that. Happy to introduce our last distinguished panelist, Ms. Eva Biaudet. Eva, as a member of parliament and a high-level government data user, what are the main challenges in getting the solid evidence you need to guide your work? What are the priority gender issues you cannot find data on? Thank you, Eva.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's actually not morning here in Finland, it's afternoon, Friday afternoon, and we are all very tired already after the long week. And I'm so sorry not having the nice background because I'm in the parliament and in my office, and we have so hard firewalls, so we couldn't get this in the system. So I'm sorry. So you get me all here in my daily office, catch me here. But I'm really, really glad and honored to be with you and with so much knowledge. Well, in a way, I think that I am very privileged in Finland because we do have a lot of data. And we do have a lot of systematic data gathered, and most of it is actually segregated. We have this book, you see, on gender equality, on statistics, every year, and it comes out in English next week. So those of you who are interested can actually write me or something. We try to send it to you. But it's really helpful because, of course, I mean, the basic thing when you want to make policies, you of course want to focus on. Did I lose you?
No, we can
No.
hear you well, Eva. Thank you.
Okay. I just lost your pictures, but that's all right. I think the main thing you want to know as a policymaker is that the decisions, the choices, the resources you allocate are working. I mean, it's not a trial and error so much. We would really, of course, it's always a trial and error in the end, but still as little as possible. So we want to have data-based policies. And actually we talk about that quite a lot, but we miss, of course, many data because it's not only about numbers and gathering numbers. And I think sometimes because there's so much knowledge to gather and so much data, so one also needs to think about what kind of data we need. And I think it was interesting, I think it was Alison to say that we need to look at the margins, so what you said. And I think that's usually the more difficult spaces for a policymaker to understand if you don't have information about, not the averages. And of course, when you gather data, also an average, nobody's an average. I mean, you really cannot make a system for an average person. You know that there are all these different features that makes all the difference, actually. So you need to understand and you need to have the different intersectionalities or the crossings, but you also need to think about who would be most important to also to understand, which we don't know so much. So there, in a way, I think that it's in a way a human rights angle. You need to sort of think about the benefits. And of course, if you are a very typical depend, of course, you have different minorities, but it's always more difficult to make policies for people whose life is sort of more further from your own life. So I think it's important to gather data, the difference in the specifics, and of course, it's important to gather data from those people who it concerns. And I think so I think that's one of the challenges for a policymaker, that we need to identify these kind of data. I think it was really, really interesting when we talked about medical and menopause. I mean, I'm 60 years old, and we just had we just organized actually a little webinar on the menopause, and we had an overflow of people coming. I mean, we had immediately 700 women coming and listening, because we actually don't know anything. And I think medicine actually is one of the least, we think we have these myths about statistics and knowledge and data that we think are sort of neutral. But of course, we know medicine is very different for women and men. And I think we have different specifics, but also how different medicines can affect. And most of the medical data or the research actually is typically done on men. In Finland, we actually have an advantage there because we have a public health system. So as a child, you actually, all your data is collected. But still, there are challenges. I have a few examples I would like to just share with you, and you have to finish me because politicians talk long. So you have to stop me if I go too far. But I would just like to mention one example or two. And I think during COVID, we have these regular health surveys on school children, and on the same age. So they go, I mean, we have decades we have done them. So you can actually also see the changes in different times. And of course, it's interesting to see what happened during the pandemic. But we could see when we were asking 12 to 16-year-old school children about their well-being. So there are these strange things that come up when you have segregated data. The girls actually answer. They are much more worried. They have much less well-being. I mean, there's a significant difference between boys and girls, but it's not coherent with how they do in school, because girls do better in school at that state. They have better grades. So there is something else going on in the world of young people that affects their well-being. I think the same thing that is really interesting and is in a way crushing myths, what we think about people. You know, we think that if you do well in school, then you do okay, but it's not necessarily like that. And the other thing is the self-conception of 10-year-olds. And we had this data gathered from what the students of 10-year-old, you know, small children, how they felt about their abilities. And it was in maths and reading. And the girls very stereotypically said that they are much better in reading than in maths. And the boys very stereotypically said that they are much better in maths and reading. And it didn't actually at all coincide with their grades. So it meant that boys also have their strong belief that they are good in maths in general. So they chose also to go further with math studies, even with lower grades, when girls only with the highest grades chose maths, because they felt that this is not for them. So we have a lot of, you know, stereotypes and myths that really guide our policies and our ways. So we need to show in the data, and I think that's when I am a politician and I go and tell this, it's really like evidence, because it's really difficult to crush stereotypes. I mean, you really need hard evidence for that, and for that you need to do this kind of I think violence is another one. You know, if we just look at violence, we can see that in Finland men die more violent deaths. But if you don't look at what kind of violence, you couldn't do any policy making, because there's a completely different pictures. Violence that men face happens, you know, in the street or somewhere else, whereas women face violence in the partnerships, you know, former partners and current partners. And of course, there's completely different policies. And the violence against women is very gendered. It's men's violence against women, and it's about discrimination, equality, about the power structures. Whereas the violence men face, which of course also is important, is about you know, social things, alcohol. So completely different policies. So we need to go further than only have general data segregated. Thank you. I could go on. This is so interesting, but I need to stop.
Oh, Eva, we would love you to go on because you are giving us so many inputs for our work. So of course, we love to hear you. And by the way, we also managed to see you in and out, so that was nice. The video was working. Yes, so first of all, congratulations to you and to our colleagues from Statistics Finland. I remember you already showed us in a previous short meeting the booklet with the key statistics for Finland that you keep with you, and you look at it every time you need a hard number, hard statistics to guide you in your work. So that's fantastic. And I think Marjut from Statistics Finland is also with us. So a big kudos to you, Marjut. I like the angle that you are promoting, and you are also reminding us that we should all adopt is the human right angle, thinking of those that are left behind, thinking also of these marginalized groups when we go on with our business of producing official statistics. Of course, those are from our point of view, from the production of data, those are the groups that are more difficult to get into our data collection. So it may be interesting actually to talk maybe with Usama on what are the challenges that we face to collect the real marginal subgroups in the population, but maybe for later if we have time. I'm all for you with the existence of this big data gap on medicines for women and for men. You mentioned it, Alison, Antonietta touched on it. So I believe that it's something that we should also reflect and take note of. And then, yes, you gave us also an example of the difference when we talk about violence, gender-based violence, and how it differs from women and men. On that, we'll have a dedicated session coming up after this, so we will bring that discussion in details in a little while. I see that there are some questions also for you on the chat, so let's move, because I have a second session for all of you, for each of you, I should say. Moving to Osama, going back to you. What are some of the lessons learned during the pandemic and what support may be needed so that these lessons learned might be carried on in a post-COVID scenario? Osama, you have the floor.
Thank you, Francesca. One of the main lessons that we have learned is that the traditional face-to-face mode of connecting with population and economic units may no longer be the most effective way or even feasible to produce official statistics, as it has been proved during the lockdown. Hence, as a statistics office leading the national statistics system, we need to have a strong resilience, fast adaptability, and responsiveness by accelerating the digital transformation and by modernization of our methods and tools. Also by looking into new ways of collecting and analyzing pre-existing data. As you know, the recent Cape Town Global Action Plan for Sustainable Development already calls for that and more, that is modernizing statistical system. In my humble point of view, in order to support countries in doing so at the global level, urgent resources to assess the gender differentiated impact of COVID-19 in general, those related to women migrant groups in particular, to be developed and shared within a capacity strengthening framework. And here I think I am also answering your question regarding the challenges to collect data for vulnerable groups. So we think that tools and resources to be developed include, but are not limited to, first, new methods of designing versatile questionnaires that can easily be adapted to different modes of data collection and also be adapted for emergent needs and emergent topics to assess gender differentiation impact of COVID-19 and the combined intersection of gender and migration. Also, it is very important, especially for those subgroups, vulnerable groups, is that sample frames and sampling methodology needs to be developed and adapted to fixed modes, especially phone data collection mode, and to overcome the coverage issue of migrant group and some specific topics such as violence, exploitation, and recruitment costs. Also, it is useful to have ways of integrating migration status and data in general and gender questions on administrative registers, which are not necessarily managed by statistical office by other different entities. Also, it would be useful to have guidance on the analysis and assessments of differentiated impact by types of inequalities on women migrants versus men migrants, for instance. And finally, all these tools and resources need to be provided within a dedicated capacity building framework. Thank you, Francesca, for your.
Thank you, Osama. Of course, I'm all with you, the importance of just keywords, right? The use of a mixed data collection approach, where we really try to target the different subgroups of the population, maybe with interviewers when it's needed, but also using some more modern methods, maybe part of the solution to improve the wealth of information that we are trying to put together. Keywords modernizing statistical offices and statistical systems, but you also touched on the importance of adjusting the sample frames and the sampling methodology to make sure that all the subgroups of the population will be part of our survey or study. Of course, importance of integrating multiple data sources, and by all means, we should try to explore much better the power of administrative records, because they are there, they're part of the government. So by all means, there has been a call for better use of those data for a while. And I believe that now also through COVID, we got the opportunity to experiment on those new data sources more and more. And I also take note of the need for guidelines on making sure that we know how to analyze the data that will be produced from a gender perspective. Moving to Alison, you mentioned important data gaps. And do you have a strategy to fill in those gaps from ARP perspective? Thank you.
Thank you. This is just, by the way, such a great, great discussion, and I'm learning so much. So, so thank you to all the other panelists too. So we do. So AARP is a very interesting organization that we really work across government, public and private sector, and sort of consumers. So we have a bit of a unique perspective when it comes to data then. And I'd say we're really doing three critical things when it comes to filling data gaps and thinking about it strategically. The first is that we've sort of created an internal strategic imperative around data advocacy, that we as an organization that focuses on older adults, and of course with that older women, are really going to be not just internally, walking the walk, but externally advocating for data issues and looking at intersectionalities of age and gender, or race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and all those things that I talked about, those intersectionalities, and that's really important. So that is something that we've been doing more of, and that's really across, I mean, here, of course, we're talking at a global level, but certainly at the federal level when we're dealing with the Census Bureau, for example. So that's been an important piece for us. And with that, also in our own work, because we have a very large research center, especially for a nonprofit, actually doing research on some of these unique issues for women, things like menopause, understanding where are the gaps for consumers and what do they need to understand. And I thought Ava's point about whenever they put on the informational session on menopause, having so many women show up, we've absolutely seen that there's a hunger for that information. And so we've been filling the data gaps in that way. Another thing that we're doing, and this is a bit at a higher level, sort of on opening the conversation and talking about stereotypes and creating data that sort of illuminates the issues around stereotypes, and particularly, of course, with older adults, looking at issues of age discrimination in the workforce. And that, of course, has a huge gender lens to take to it. Another bit of work that we've been doing recently that I've found really interesting is work in looking at media stereotypes of older persons, and particularly again with a gender lens there, and looking at the imagery that's put out and how older adults and older women are actually represented in the media. And we've been doing content analysis, we're doing deep experimental work and looking at implicit bias, and all of that is to sort of bring the data back, whether it's again to government or private sector, to say, we're really defining the problem here. Okay, here's the problem. Here's the needle, right? How do we move it? And setting goals for moving out of data. And we think that that's a really critical piece. And then the last piece of work that we're doing is actually building databases and platforms for others to use around data collection. So we just launched, I think this was about 3 months ago, we just launched in the US, the first probability panel that is focused on the 50 plus people. And so that's with NORC out of the University of Chicago, And so it's called Foresight 50+. And again, of course, you know, we've been recruiting a lot of women into that probability panel. Have to, it's a probability panel, but that's a critical piece of something. And then we're also looking at areas where we can build platforms based in sort of partnerships or collective action. So another initiative that we're working on right now is around looking at the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander population, which has incredibly difficult and unique data needs. And again, women is an interesting, you know, specific intersection there. And so that's something where we're looking at taking that on as a community, even if we're really leading the charge. So a lot of things that we're doing in this area. I think importantly, reinforcing earlier comments, you know, that both I said, but also others have said about, you know, the need to move past averages, to look at intersectionalities such as gender and age or socioeconomic status. All of those are things, again, that we are doing with our own work, but that we're also advocating out with governments and in the marketplace.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alison, for your additional contribution to this discussion. Just following up, I'm so happy to hear that there is a probability panel on 50+ people that are older than 50. Do we have access to this data? How does it work? Do we all have access, or what's the process to get access to this information?
Sure, absolutely. So it is, I mean, it is a resource in that, you know, certainly organizations can pay to do surveys on it, but then we will also be releasing large studies every year based in that panel that will be free. So everything the AARP does is free to everybody. That's part of our mission. And so a lot of that will be coming out. And of course, we always look at gender as an important lens within that work.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And for all our audience, please get in contact with Alison. We will definitely do that for additional information also on the important results of that research. And also for you, yesterday, you touched on the stereotypes in media. Yesterday, we had a fantastic keynote speech by Thomas Gunnarsson, who is the gender photographer, and he touched exactly on those points, right, of what we need to do to avoid stereotypes and gender cliches in media. Moving on to Antonietta. Antonietta, you have been recommending sex disaggregated data per default. That's very strong. What are the statistical motivations behind the suggestion that personal data, individual data, should be collected by default with the sex attribute? Thank you, Antonietta.
Yes, let me first tell you about the current practice adopted by many countries. Well, if the sex and gender dimension is considered relevant for the analysis, this information is collected. The main rationale of this practice is to avoid to collect unnecessary data. It is a burden for the respondent, who might be discouraged by too long questionnaires, and for the data management. We, on the other hand, believe that including the sex and gender dimension in the collection of data only a posteriori, when this dimension is considered relevant, might not be the best solution. It is true that the OECD and the United Nations have guidelines to help assess whether the gender perspective is relevant for a study. However, there are considerations that hint into the fact that it is time to adopt a reverse approach. So here is the suggested alternative. Data collection should follow by default the criterion of sex distinction and neglect it only when it is undeniably irrelevant. This should be one of the lessons learned from the pandemic. And here are my motivations. First, data collected today for one purpose will often be used tomorrow for another. And the value of data increases the more it is used to answer interesting questions. When collecting data, it is hard, if not impossible, to foresee ex ante all possible usage of data and thus to decide whether the sex perspective is or not relevant. Having data organized by default by sex extraordinarily increases its potential, prolongs its life, and therefore reduces the overall expense of data collection activities. Second, In statistics, we want to identify and control sources of variability. Now, there are good biological, economical, and social reasons, among others, to believe that sex and gender are a big source of variability across many domains. Third, when data is collected to provide actionable insight for policymaking, we need to know if the policy implications of the intervention have a differential effect for male and female. There might be situations where at population level there is an overall benefit, but for example, the policy has positive implications for female and negative implications for male. So collecting data with the sex dimension by default facilitates an ethical and fair outcome of policy measures. Fourth, there is a risk of inconsistencies if data collection is not performed at the same time and with the same criteria. And consistently collected data really facilitate comparisons and data interoperability. Trying to go back in time to track down is much more expensive, both in time and money, and more error prone. Then many machine learning or artificial intelligence algorithms are biased by sex and gender, and we need data to correct for such biases. Last but not least, data availability by sex is necessary to assess progress towards the majority of United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So to conclude, it is clear that the pandemic has accelerated many processes. The hope is that we have learned lessons from the crisis, and this is an important one, namely that data must be collected by default with the sex dimension, and possibly, as you were mentioning before, also with the age dimension. Thank you, Francesca, and thanks to all other panelists. I'm also learning a lot.
Thank you, Antonietta. You are the revolutionary here. I can tell you this is a very strong recommendation that I personally strongly support. Of course, so far we have been asked to go the other way around. Usually, when we ask to have this information in household surveys or household surveys, maybe it's more straightforward because usually we work with people. But when we look at other data sources, we need to make the case of why that specific source is important from a gender perspective. Now, what we are saying is that per default, there should be an agreement that everything should be collected with the sex dimension, with the understanding that it will be also, in addition to all the good points that you mentioned, it would also be a more efficient way of producing statistics. So I'm definitely all for it. Thank you, Antonietta. Moving back to you, Maria Isabel. First I have Eva, and then we'll go to Maria Isabel. Eva, as a statistical community, so most of us in the room today, I can tell you, are data producers. So as a statistical community, how can we support you better in your work? Do you have any recommendations to improve the evidence base to inform policies for gender equality? Thank you, Eva.
Thank you. It's so inspiring. Well, of course, we always want to have everything easier accessible. I mean, and numbers are, I mean, for some people, numbers are very easy, but for many people, numbers are not so easy. So I think that one perhaps need to have different ways of presenting also data. And I for policymaker in particular, we have a lot of information. It needs to be fast and easy to get grasp, or actually at least to catch the attention and to catch the main thing. So I think in a way there is a lot of things to do, and then it has to be relevant, of course. If you feel that the data, and I think here we have touched upon many issues, even COVID, we have talked about migration, about minorities, about sort of smaller the margins, and I think that policymakers if they feel that the data is sort of relevant to their work, they are definitely interested. One thing that I noticed during the pandemic of COVID is that actually, and I think that this has been lessons learned sort of from practice all over the world, that countries with sort of a strong civil society, and of course we have very different societies, but where there has been a strong civil society and a grassroots level, that creates resilience, because you find ways of supporting each other, information flows, you get to know who needs help, you can do a lot of things, you can perhaps work for somebody else, and you can survive in a different way. But also we see that, for instance, because there were so many restrictions, people didn't turn to authorities as much. You actually, it was easier to turn to, for instance, an NGO or a lower level. So again, the thing with the violence against women, for instance, we saw an amazing rise of contacts to NGOs. And I think without having, in a way, gathering data from this informal sector, not only from authorities, in some way, we will never have the complete picture, or at least a fuller picture. So in a way, from perhaps not very traditional data sources, to find different ways on how to gather data, because I do understand that it probably would be impossible to compare because they are so different, and it's not done in such a systematic way, but still that might be valuable data, and to think about what kind of data and how it could be useful. And then I think the other one, you already talked about media. I think the media and the policymakers, it's a little bit the same. Pictures is marvelous. And I think you all know the Swedish author Hans Rosling, or the professor who wrote the book Factfulness. We talked about it, I think, at some point. And it was amazing. I mean, I have been working on human rights. I've been working on, global issues for years and years. And his way of presenting data, and of course, that was his point, that actually we are living in a way we are not able to process all this data that flows over us in a way that makes sense, and in a way that it's data-based knowledge. We have this perception of all the problems, that everything gets worse, it's everything gets poorer, famine just rises. And of course, we do have a lot of global challenges and problems, but we also have steps forwards, which have been following policies. And of course, this is really, really important to know. And what he showed, that, it makes sense to try to create a better world. It makes sense to have coherent policies, to have cooperation in the world. And we shouldn't just, think that there's no use doing anything. And I think his way of presenting really turns our heads. And I think, for instance, the one video with the washing machine, I don't know if you remember, when he actually showed that the washing machine made, children read better because the mothers had time to read with the children, and he could show how much it actually helped. So in a way, that was information. And of course, also just the numbers of income, and how countries have sort of moved forward to a more middle income status than before. I think that was really amazing. So it sounds perhaps a little bit terrible for you, who are all intellectuals and working with these numbers, but I think that this gap between research and knowledge and practical information in this world, where we have a lot of information, is really one of the main challenges, because we of course don't do anything with the information if we can't make use of it, if we don't know how to, and we need a little bit of help in that. Please. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Taking notes, of course. You're not the first one to tell us that we should improve the way we disseminate the information, the way we communicate the information, and we are really trying to improve on that.
It has gone a lot better. It's a lot better than before.
Thank you. And You mentioned our teacher and role model, Hans Rosling, who used to work with us over the years with the UN Statistics Division. We had a very close collaboration. He would come and really do webinars with us and training. And I would invite all our participants to Google him and look at his fantastic videos, because they are really, really exceptional. So that's a point well taken, Eva. We'll bring it to the different level to make sure that everyone understands the importance of communicating our results. We do fantastic analysis, but sometimes we get stuck or lost, and we don't go the extra step to make sure that the information, the key points are really visible and understandable by our key players like you. I also like that you mentioned the importance of working with the non-traditional data sources. You mentioned NGOs. I would add also the citizen-generating data. We heard a lot about the importance of these stakeholders as data producers, particularly during the COVID pandemic. So this is also something we will take note of. So thank you so much. Maria Isabel, you have the last word, and then we'll. I think there are a couple of questions for you. And just checking with my colleagues, we still have a few minutes, right? This is up to 9:20. Am I correct? Yes. Okay. Thank you. So, Maria Isabel, what are the next steps from UNSD's perspective? Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to my fellow panelists, because they are giving us lots of ideas and lots of homework. From UNSD point of view, our eyes are set at improving the availability of granular data and disaggregated data, while at the same time setting standards to be able to produce comparable data across countries. And that is really no easy endeavor. As I mentioned earlier, disaggregated data remains scarce in very key areas, and this hampers the opportunity to narrow inequalities between women and men, and inequalities between different population groups. And we can see that even in the in our agenda, the SDG 2030 agenda. For instance, we made an analysis. Can I have my slide, please? We made an analysis of the 82 indicators that have been identified by the Interagency Group on Gender Stats as relevant for gender. And then we did our own analysis, and as a rule of thumb, we found 54 indicators that are relevant for migration, and 48 relevant for disability. And these are the overlaps. Fortunately, most of the overlap indicators are available with sex disaggregation, but we are still pretty much blind in terms of migratory status or disability status. And this is deeply, deeply concerning, particularly now that the world is trying to look ahead into recovery from the pandemic. How can policymakers steer recovery in a fairer way, or how can we build forward better? Disaggregated data on migration, disability, and other factors are going to be essential. These we are calling them data gaps, but I see them as data blinds, because they impede us from seeing clearly who are the population groups that are most disadvantaged and most in need of targeted policies. The issue of granular data is even included in the SG report called Our Common Agenda. This is a document that highlights the topmost priorities of the UN and the Secretary General's vision from a human point of view, to ensure that everyone is seen and recognized. Disaggregating data by age, gender, and other diversity factors are urged. For that, we're doing our homework, and UNSD is working hand in hand with experts from developing and developed countries to better connect policy with data issues. We're trying to strike a balance between setting standards but at the same time promoting comparable statistics across countries. We're striving to formulate standards that are less rigid, that are more attuned to the country's needs. We are trying to follow a hands-on approach, a bottom-up approach that hears from the field. We are trying to invest into a different approach to capacity building and to data capacities, trying to design practical tools that are very actionable, that can be easily adapted and adopted by our colleagues in the national statistical offices in countries. And a case in point is the work that we are carrying out in the field of migration statistics, together with the group of experts we have. For example, we have designed a set of suggested questions to capture migratory status that can be used in censuses and in surveys, even surveys that are not dedicated completely or specialized to migration. This set of questions can be appended to other surveys. And this is precisely with the aim of producing more easily granular data that can be disaggregated. We are also supporting countries, particularly our colleagues in the NSOs, to better access other data that is available already at the national level, to assess what they have, to better use it to forge partnerships with other governmental agencies, but also with new actors like the NGOs. So there is a lot of things still to be done, but we are changing our traditional way of working. We're trying to be much more flexible and much more attuned to what countries need in this time of crisis and need. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Isabel. A lot of work ahead, but also very exciting. You may want to add maybe on the chat the link to the material that you just mentioned, you know, the set of questions to get some sort of standardization or harmonization across countries when we collect information on international migration. We are doing very well in terms of time. I think we had a very interesting discussion, ping-ponging among the different panelists. You are all fantastic. We have a couple of questions that we could still take. So there is one specific for you, Eva, from a colleague from India. So it was pointed out that there was limited sex data during COVID-19 and on COVID data, and even lesser gender data on vaccination and menstruation health and on pregnant women. Despite most countries decided to proceed with vaccination, so as a policymaker, how did this data handicap or lack of data impacted your policies with regards to COVID-19 vaccination protocol, and how did you address those challenges? Eva, if you want to reply to that question.
Thank you. I'm not sure I am able to give you the full picture, but I think that there was debate on this, and I think our health authorities were actually addressed with these questions. And indeed, the vaccination with pregnant women didn't start until very late, because there was this discussion that we were not sure about the effects that the health authorities were not sure. And not until quite late this information came out that now it's safe and actually it's recommended. So we had these recommendations. And for instance, we also changed when there was sort of where these results were come with this AstraZeneca, you remember this vaccine, there was actually the authorities, even if they said that they felt that it's not a big issue, health issue, that this is a, you know, if you compare to the pill, the risks were much lower, but because there was so, because it was so much needed that people wouldn't have these fears. And I think in that case, we actually probably were a little bit, we were very careful about all the signs or the data that actually came out with possible risks. and they actually changed so that they wouldn't give it anymore. They changed the vaccine. So in that sense, I think we had a very good situation, and we felt that we could trust our health authorities. And there is a very high trust in Finland towards our health authorities, I must say, because everybody are included in the public health sector, and so this is something that there is a strong base. So I can imagine that there's differences. We could see, nevertheless, and I think this is not something we really know yet, but we have sort of, you can see from the data collected that it was that probably, that is my sort of interpretation, that the trust wasn't so big on people who were sort of not born Finns, who hadn't lived in our country, migrated people. That for us it was sort of self-evident that that we know that we have research. It's sort of data-based decisions, but there was differences in behavior on preparedness to take the vaccine. So it took a longer time to get the vaccinations going with population groups that didn't have so high, or actually, I don't know actually what's the differing. That's something that we should actually probably have more information on to know what exactly is the reason. But we could see that there were higher numbers of, for instance, migrated people. I don't know if that's the only. It can be just something that we think. So we don't actually know. But I didn't feel that we had these problems. But we were trusting a lot our health and we felt that they were sort of research based and evidence based decisions. But what do I know?
Thank you, Eva. We also have a remark or a comment from our colleague from Switzerland. She is also reminding us of the importance of collecting data on girls and the boys' perspective. And of course, as it was already mentioned yesterday, we should also include systematically boys and men's perspectives and experiences in our gender statistics. So I think that's something that has been promoted a few times between yesterday and today. That's, I'm sure, also very much in line with the comments from our colleagues from UNICEF. And I'm inviting everyone to take a look at the chat. There is additional material on the work on UNICEF, on children and girls in particular. And then we have one, I believe, last question from a colleague who is asking talking about important disaggregations, importance of intersectionalities. We talk about gender inequalities, and he or she would like to have additional information on the very important also is important geographical data and the importance of localizing the facts. So maybe any of you would like to comment on this? What happens in rural and urban areas? Of course, ideally from a gender lens, women and men in rural areas and women and men in urban areas, and women, the difference between women in rural and urban areas. I don't know if any of our panelists would like to comment on that, if you have any data. Otherwise, I give you another option. We are almost concluding the session. Maybe that's your opportunity to say your last keyword, what you want the audience really to remember out of your intervention. Yes, Osama?
Actually, I'd just like to answer a question from a colleague from UNHCR, which he asked about Moroccan experience conducting survey Indeed, as I have mentioned in my first intervention, HCP has conducted during the pandemic, during COVID-19, has conducted a survey on refugees in order to assess the impact of this pandemic on these fragments of population. And indeed, it has been very challenging task to conduct this survey, knowing that it's not a traditional normal household survey where you just go to the field and conduct a simple sample randomly. So you need to have these people, you need to have trained of this sample, and by the time you design your questionnaire, by the time you train your enumerators, those people have moved elsewhere. They are maybe not even in the country anymore. So it has been very important to work closely, actually, with UNHCR as collaborator, and we work also with the Ministry of Interior, which provided us with the list of all refugee data. We also worked with local NGOs, which have been paramount important, not only in providing where these people are, but also with having access and gaining their trust to be able to respond properly to questions. So indeed, it's very, very important to have different way of working with this specific subgroup of population in order to have meaningful results and answers. And of course, the report is published as well as all the other reports I have mentioned. And I will be happy to share them with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sama, and thank you for helping me. It was such a long text. I didn't see that there was actually a question. Apologies for our colleagues from UNHCR who are doing a fantastic work in promoting and producing statistics on forcibly displaced persons. So that's also very well noted. Going back, we need to wrap up because we are moving into the next session on violence against women or gender-based violence. So I hope you are all staying with us. I want to give you this last 30 seconds of spotlight to all of you if you wanted to end it with a keyword. What's the most important thing you want the participants to remember out of this very rich discussion? I know what Antonietta is going to say, but...
Yes, well, yeah, my keywords is that data should be collected with the sex dimension by default.
Thank you. Alison?
Sorry, I was muting and unmuting myself. Intersectionality. I think the conversations we've had on bringing age and gender or other issues like rural and urban is critical.
Thank you. And we have Eva.
Thank you, and thank you all. It has been a wonderful session. I think it's important to know that if you want to achieve gender equality and equality among people, you cannot think about it as that the measures or the policies must always be the same. It is the result. It is the goal that matters, the position they're coming. And for that, you need to understand the differences, the different circumstances, the differences in their lives. So I think that to see women also as a particular group, and then of course as different sort of a variety of women, is necessary to be able to build better policies and equality. Thank you.
Thank you. And Osama?
Just, we have to be ready. We have to be ready for changes, for things like that. So that will be my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. And Maria Isabel?
To me, the key message is that if we want the granular data that we need to be more flexible in our ways of thinking, breaking away from the rigid structures to be able to make the best of available data and to produce better data. So flexibility in our design.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I would like really to give you a big round of applause. I cannot do it just virtually. You did all a fantastic job. And to our audience, I can see the clapping going on, the virtual, so that's fantastic. Let's take a 10 minutes break. Please stay with us. We are having a very rich discussion on measuring and monitoring violence against women. We will start at 9:30 sharply. So closing this session, but I look forward to the next one. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Hello?
Hi, Angela.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Francesca, should we wait for you or should we
No,
start?
no, over to you.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, well, good afternoon from Vienna, here in Austria. My name is Angela May. I'm the Chief of Research at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime here in Vienna. And I will be hosting 4 fabulous speakers to discuss together violence against women. Well, we hope this session will be more forward-looking. And so to discuss violence against women measurement more in its entirety, and then also to learn what the COVID disruption of all our life has told us about the measurement of violence against women. And as many things in our life, the COVID brought some challenges, but also some opportunities. So we hope we can discuss also what are the opportunities in terms of learning, in terms of new ways or more modern way of measuring violence against women. So I will start by giving the floor to the 4 panelists. First of all, I just want to remind maybe the panelists if you can keep your answer short so that we can have a round of 2 or 3 discussion among the speakers and also address some of the questions. So if you allow me, I will start with Dr. Claudia Garcia Moreno. Claudia is currently heading the unit on addressing the needs of vulnerable populations in the Department of Sexual and Reproductive Health and Research of the World Health Organization. She has over 30 years of experience, and I'm sure many of you in the audience know the great work that she has led in WHO in terms of measuring violence against women around the world and providing policymakers with data that can help them. So I'll just start with you, Claudia, just maybe to ask us, I will ask all the panelists, just 2 minutes to tell us, what do you think are today the opportunities and challenges in relation of measuring violence against women? Over to you, Claudia, can you?
Yes, unmuting myself. Thank you, Angela, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Challenges and opportunities. I mean, I think one of the biggest opportunities has been the Sustainable Development Goals and the fact that for the first time we have 2 violence against women related indicators in the gender equality target. And I think that that has provided a really important opportunity to strengthen data collection, reporting, and use by encouraging member states to report on this regularly. And then, as you mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought this quite unprecedented attention from policymakers and others to the problem, which again, I think has encouraged and, and raised awareness about the importance of data. I think we've come a long way from where we were when we started, some of us started this work, and in terms of the level of awareness and interest in the public in general and among governments on the issue. I think there's more awareness also of the impact of this violence against women and the health and of women, their children, the social and economic costs. And in the latest update of the prevalence estimates that we just published earlier this year, we see that we have made a lot of progress in terms of data availability, at least for those 2 forms of violence that we are capturing: intimate partner violence and non-partner sexual violence. We have 159 countries that have at least one survey between 2000 and 2018 for intimate partner, and 137 countries that have non-partner sexual violence. So lots of much more data available than we had even 10 years ago. At the same time, in terms of challenges, we need to ensure that the data is collected in accordance to international standards. There's still several gaps in the data, and I hope I can say a little bit more about that. And also that the data needs to be collected in a manner that is ethical and is also safe for both the women who are responding, the survivors, and also for interviewers. And it's not always easy to tell whether this is happening or not. The second issue is that it needs to be collected on a regular basis, not too frequently, which wouldn't be a good use of resources because the prevalence doesn't change from one year to the other, but also regularly enough that we can track some progress.
Thank you.
If I can have my one slide, just to say, and the third point is that there are also still some regional gaps. This slide just shows the proportion of countries with data on. Is it possible to show the slide?
Okay, maybe we can show it while we wrap up this discussion on challenges, opportunities.
I have only one slide that shows the number of countries that have data by SDG region, and as you will see, there is still some regions, particularly Northern Africa and Western Asia, that need, where data is still not very much data is available. And my very last point is that we need to have a balance between investing in programming and investing in data and in documenting the problem, because obviously if we're not investing in prevention and service availability, etc., we're not going to see any change in our numbers. So important to really keep a good balance in terms of investing in programming as well as data collection. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Claudia. And now I'll ask the same question. So to Ola. Ola, are you with us? I don't see on the screen. Ola?
Angela, I'm not sure she's with us yet. So
Okay.
we're trying to reach out. Maybe you want to move to the next and then.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so Kati, Kaukinen, she has a PhD and is a professor and chair in the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Central Florida. Her interests include intimate partner violence, long-term consequences of victimization, victim coping resilience, and a series of other issues related. So what I will do, as I did for Claudia, I will put the bio in the chat, the long bio, so that you can all read and appreciate the great work that the panelists have done in their life. But Kati, can I ask you also maybe to be shorter than Claudia, because otherwise we cannot go through everyone. In your view, the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity? No, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so my challenge really does lead to the opportunity we have. We work in silos, and this is incredibly problematic that we're working in these silos. We have sociologists, criminologists, public health, etc., working independently, and it hasn't led to the dramatic declines of violence against women internationally that we need to see. And so my opportunity that I would love for everyone to share is a transdisciplinary team science approach to violence against women. We need to work across these disciplinary boundaries. We need to include practitioners in our work. We need to partner with federal agencies, with politicians, and those who are able to make change, to be able to come up with not only new ways of thinking about how to collect data on violence against women, but access that data and to develop new theoretical frameworks to solve the problem of violence against women. And it also needs to be nimble. I'll just quickly say, as we work together in teams, we need to be nimble to how violence changes over time. The internet is a great example. It provides opportunities for victims to seek help, but also serves as a way in which perpetrators can continue to victimize women. So team science, you'll probably hear it from me again.
Thank you. And thank you for the sharp and brief points. So now we have Marjut, and I apologize because I'm sure I will mispronounce your last name, Pietiläinen. And Marjut is a gender statistics expert and the team leader at Statistics Finland. She's an active member of several national and international expert groups, and I'm sure many of you in the audience knows her because she chairs this group, the EAG Gender Statistics group. So Marjut, your few points on the biggest challenge and opportunity that you see.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this session and previous excellent presentations. I thought about what I would choose because I noticed that there is only one biggest challenge and one opportunity. I think the biggest challenge is the lack of data. And with this, I mean actually many things, lack of different kinds of data to show the different angles of the phenomenon and different forms of violence. And for example, I think we need information from different sources, and we have to look these together. Of course, there are problems in lack of money, lack of will, and lack of understanding the phenomenon and how large impacts violence has for individuals, families, children, and for the whole society. And there is also a lack of administrative data and registers. And even if we have those, there might be insufficiency in data, for example, missing information on a victim-perpetrator relationship. And for improving this, we need collaboration and improvements in information systems. registers are really significant, showing the power of data. For this example, we have Finnish studies on the effects of the cost of family violence, for example, in Finnish healthcare. My colleague Laura will put the link to the chat box to that survey or study. And of course, there is a small proportion of information enters to records, and this why we need also population data collection that also provides information from those who have not sought help for violence or whose applications for assistance has not been recorded. We also lack information data for on minorities and in the terms of leaving no one behind. And the most vulnerable people are potentially not involved in the surveys. Those who do not participate in population surveys are, however, reached through registers, and in this sense, registers are crucial. We also lack continuous and sustainable data. But then the biggest opportunity, I will choose that I'm optimistic person, and I think there's the biggest one is understanding. We need to understand why this is important, and what kind of data we need, and what is behind, and what the data tell us. I think it's the most important thing and the biggest opportunity. I have many points here, but I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you much. Now I see that Ola has joined us. Ola, we are just very briefly discussing, starting with each panelist, saying what in their view is the biggest challenge, the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunities on measuring violence against women. And let me introduce you, Ola. Again, I'm sure many of you in the audience know you, but we over 20 years of experience working on various topics, including modernization of statistics, sustainable development, gender equality, youth, labor market, Palestinian economy. We all know you because you lead brilliantly and manage you are the president of the Bureau of the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics. And so, Ola, tell us in a couple of minutes, what is in your view the biggest challenge and opportunity?
Thank you so much, Angela. I may start with the challenge. I may say the huge size of the data required to cover violence against women. We have also, I may say, in our region, the weak admin records that don't provide the comprehensive data on violence against women. And I may add also the challenge associated with the level of response when we go to household surveys, to the surveys questions, due to the sensitivity of questions in that perspective, and the ability also, I may add, to monitor the impact of the abnormal and unusual conditions on the phenomena of violence against women, especially when we're going to address the impact of the pandemic in that perspective. This is the challenge from my perspective. The opportunities, we have so many opportunities because we are actually learning every day, and we have so many lessons learned that we share experiences with other sisters organizations. And also, I may add, with the civil organization, that we start to have more common language in that perspective. So, and I want to add the availability, which helped us so much, of the UN guidelines for producing statistics on violence against women. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola. So let's start maybe another round of questions, and then we take, if there are questions from the audience, after this round, maybe we can take any question you may have. I know that there are some pre-sended questions, but let me start. Claudia, in your view, you know, we have done, I mean, so much is never enough on violence against women surveys. And also we have, again, never enough, but you know, we have also developed international standards, international practices, and so on. So do we need more beyond surveys in terms of international standards, and particularly on administrative statistics? You're muted. You're muted, Claudia.
There we go. Thank you. No, I'm going to start with talking a little bit about surveys, because we have more availability and also more consistency in the way we are measuring things, and thanks in part to the UN guidelines that have been mentioned already. But we still find inconsistencies in several aspects of the way that we are operationalizing questions. For example, whether we're capturing all partners or only current or most recent partners, how we operationalize psychological IPV, what threshold do we use to say that, you know, psychologically abusive acts are prevalent, etc. So there are still gaps. There are gaps that have been mentioned already around, for example, women with disabilities. We're not really capturing some of the very specific types of violence that they may be facing, or older women, or as mentioned, also new forms of abuse, such as cyberbullying or other technologically perpetrated by technology. Within non-partner sexual violence, what we found in this new, just recent round of estimates is that the current measures really are just capturing the tip of the iceberg. They focus on rape and rape through the use of physical force. So they're not really capturing the gamut of forms of sexual violence that we know women and girls are exposed to. And we're also not capturing sexual harassment. So there's quite a few things that we can still strengthen in our surveys. And we need to continue to expand the kinds of violence we're capturing while keeping surveys manageable, so that we don't compromise the quality of the data. In terms of administrative data, I think they are an important complement to prevalence survey data, but they also give us a different kind of information. We know that very few incidents, or, you know, everything from 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 incidents, depending on which country and which survey you look at, is reported to the police. We know that not all women who experience abuse will seek healthcare, even when they have health impacts, or when they seek healthcare, they will not disclose necessarily. So the information that we get from service-related administrative data doesn't really give us a true, you know, a figure close to the true prevalence, but it can definitely inform us about help-seeking behavior, about gaps in services, about how we can strengthen access and reporting, and how we can plan and services. And the current challenges have been mentioned again already, relate to the quality and the completeness of some of our administrative data and the inability to link up the different sources. As part of the joint program on violence against women data under the leadership of UN Women, there are efforts underway to develop guidance for strengthening the quality and coordination of administrative data, and hopefully this will be available for piloting very soon. And so I think we need to really combine all different kinds of data, triangulate data so that we can build the complex picture that we have. And then, as has been mentioned in the previous panel and in this one, really trying to identify those groups of women which suffer multiple discriminations, vulnerabilities, which we are not yet capturing, either in our administrative data or in our survey data. Looking at issues of migration, indigenous status, you know, disability, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, and I think the last point I would make is that we need to really strengthen the spaces where we bring together data producers and users. I think this is beginning, and this meeting and others like it are an important means for this, but we really need to make sure that the data is feeding into policy and programming, and that as data producers, we also understand the needs of the data users. And lastly, any data collection, whether it's service-related, administrative, or other one, needs to be grounded in the principle of doing no harm, and that we do it in a way that contributes to survivors and to non-violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. So we go back to Kathy. Kathy, you have done research work on the impact of violence, on the impact of COVID, sorry, on violence against women. So are there lessons learned from the COVID on collecting violence against women data?
Definitely. Definitely. So as you know, we have very large systematic review meta-analysis, and we find that the aggregate increase in domestic violence was about 8% in the United States and 7% internationally. And the one thing I think that's the most important to note here is some of the anecdotal comments that have come out from different agencies across the United States and in our earlier meeting across the world, actually, is that while we're seeing increases, that these are likely an underrepresentation or a small fraction of what's going on. We know that police data is measuring two things. It's measuring real behavior, so real victimizations, but it's also tapping both victim decisions to report, neighbors reporting, but also police behavior. So the earlier question on what is administrative data and what's its value really is in looking at trends in when do police arrest, when do prosecutors prosecute these cases, and what types of sanctions or rehabilitative strategies are put in place. And what we know, at least from the state I live in, is that police did not come in the door for misdemeanor and less severe types of violence. And that's incredibly problematic. They were making decisions at the door. And so we need to begin to untangle the data on arrest and look at, are these new victims? Are they victims who had been historically victimized? And begin to also look at issues of severity. So it really is the tip, and it provides us with a jumping off point as we move forward.
Thank you, Kathy. And I think I really share what you said, Evan, but I felt when we had to measure the trend and what was happening in COVID is that most of measures are based on prevalence on number, but not on severity. And so, probably what happened during COVID, that particularly the severity increased, but the big number. So thank you. And also to reference to the administrative data. So Marju, also from your side, from a National Statistical Office side, has COVID give us any lesson, or have you seen also anything that big data can help us with?
Thank you. Of course, we have learned lessons. In the time of crisis, the need of data is rapid, and we need rapid sources of funding and launch research project and surveys. But the crucial thing is the good cooperation between stakeholders, data producers, users, and decision makers. It's crucial to show the need of the data and find funding, and also cooperation in disseminating results and make statistics visible is very important. In Finland, Finnish Parliament has granted additional funding for research during the crisis, and for example, it was possible in Finland to monitor the operation of shelters and the phone that helped Nolla Linja in the real time, the helpline. There was also an opportunity for both services to respond quickly to being sent to gather national information on the effects of the COVID crisis on the lives of those who experienced violence. We have several other projects going on. My colleague will put the links to the chat box, so I won't go to those further. I think I love registers, but I love service as well and other qualitative data. I think all of those are so important. But during the crisis, administrative data is very important because it's sustainable, and even it doesn't tell about the experiences. It's important for monitoring and how the things are going on in Finland. Like Eva told, we trust authorities and police and so on. So in Finland, it's not a big problem. People are reporting the cases, but of course not all. And this is why we need of course, surveys and other data. These data from service providers is exceptional or very important. And Also, like Eva told, informal sector is very important, and also big data can offer us data rapidly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, Ola, from your side, so maybe do we go back to the survey, because you have done in Palestine recently a survey. So, you know, what do you see the next challenge for for violence against women survey? What should we focus? I mean, Claudia at the beginning mentioned something on you know, developing more refined the methodology on certain type of crimes, particularly the cyber type that are emerging. Certain issues identify also, you know, characterize the women. They are not all the same. So from your perspective in Palestine, what have you learned?
First, I agree with Claudia on what she has mentioned on developing the methodology. I may add also from our experience, it's really very important, because when we talk about violence indicators, they are really very, very sensitive when we conduct the household surveys. So it's really important to develop and enhance the household survey tools for violence survey from one perspective. And also, I mean, to use other means. For example, I mean, in the violence survey that we recently conducted, I mean, we used cards for these sensitive questions, and it was really very helpful, and it increased the response rate. So it's really very important to think out of the box how we can improve also the tools that can bring more response, and also think about how we can increase the coverage. The other thing that I would like also to add, it is important also to be proactive in that perspective for the NSOs, and to communicate well with all the relevant parties. I feel from my experience as the chief statistician in Palestine, it's not our role only to, you know, to provide official statistics and only to do a data production and dissemination. So we have to think really more out of the box in the communication level, and to have, I agree also with the point on having more visibility of the data, and make sure how we can communicate with all of our partners and involve beyond just producing official statistics. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola. So there are some comments and one question that came, I think, before a section. So I will just read. I'm more kind of reflecting also the experiences of others. So there is UNODC, Salome, she's the coordinator of the Center of Excellence that we as UNODC have jointly with INEGI in Mexico. And she wants to tell us that indeed, together with the Center of Excellence on Gender Statistics in Mexico, we are developing a new statistical framework to measure femicide. And I was reflecting when you were discussing the pros and cons of administrative data. And indeed, administrative data, we all know they have the limitation that they don't measure the whole iceberg. They just measure what the iceberg comes at surface. But on femicide, there is one, if you want, advantage. We have the same for homicide when we look at the crime statistics, is that usually bodies get reported. And so, you know, the killing, so it is the tip of the iceberg, but the advantage of that indicator is that in a way it's cheap, in the sense that there is a routine collection. We can discuss how can improve it and make crime statistics more sensitive to that, but in a way is not, and can be follow more easily in a way over time. That surveys are definitely, of course, more comprehensive and you know, can reflect better the phenomenon, but they're very expensive, and so you know they are not, cannot be undertaken, or cannot, maybe they should, but at the moment. They're not undertaken regularly every year. So, so that is the. I'm sorry, but being by you from UNODC, I'm about passionate about that. Then ESQA wants to tell us that They have a violence against women toolkit. Member country, they said evidence on violence against women, including during crisis, to announce violence against women toolkit and member countries' progress in producing comparable violence against women data as per regional guidelines. And they send a link. I don't know if colleagues from UNSD can put the link, but otherwise I will include the link in the chat. And then UN Women, they say we are currently undertaking rapid gender assessments on the impact of COVID-19 on violence against women in 13 countries across regions. The surveys are being implemented in 2 phases. First, in May, June, a second phase will be undertaken, is being currently undertaken, benefiting from the substantial learning from the former on-survey approach instrument and field operation. And this effort has included innovative approaches on measuring violence against women with using vignettes and list randomization question that have been developed in consultation with the World Bank. So we are looking forward to see the results of the UN Women effort, particularly really better understanding the impact of COVID. Then the last comment, and then there is a question that I will ask the panelists maybe to address, is from Mexico. And they want to announce the upcoming national survey on violence against women in Mexico. And they ask a question regarding the impact of COVID on prevalence statistics at public spaces. So I'm wondering if any of you wants to comment on the public spaces, because we heard a lot indeed on the impact of COVID on domestic violence. Any of you, I don't know, Kathy, in your research, have you looked at anything on public spaces?
Can you ask the question again with respect to
if the impact of COVID on prevalence statistics at public spaces?
With respect to violence against women specifically?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yes.
So we actually do, we've done some work on some other types of crime as well, looking at COVID. So those that occur in public spheres, so burglary, but not specific to just violence against women. And we do know that some rates went down because of lockdowns and stay-at-home orders that didn't place people in public spaces. Bars were closed. So in cities like New York City, bars were closed for a very long amount of time, and we did not have the types of interactions that we did prior to COVID. So I think some of that work is being done in all sorts of spheres as well.
Thank you, Kathy. And Ola, there is a question for you in the chat. I don't know if you have seen, we hear and understand you in terms of challenges, especially on asking sensitive questions during the pandemic. I may have missed it, but wanted to hear whether violence against women data was collected remotely, and whether did you ask direct experience of violence against women? And is somebody from UN Women, and they're referring to the assessment that they are doing in 13 countries. Ola.
Thank you, Angela. The survey that we conducted, it was actually before the pandemic. So it was face-to-face interview. It wasn't remotely at all. And during the pandemic, we were unable to do any data collection except remotely. But for violence, it is really very difficult to do it remotely. So that's why, I mean, the issue in the pandemic that we worked very closely with the civil organizations and the Ministry of Women Affairs. The civil organizations, they were the one who are in the field, and we helped them to address, specific questions from the violence survey. So they are the one, and we actually coordinated very closely with the civil organizations, and it was such a very fruitful experience.
Thank you. Well, in the chat, there is Margie Guerrero that is reminded us, that's interesting, I didn't know. So the first international treaty to recognize the right of everyone to a world of work free from violence and harassment, including gender-based violence and harassment. Oh, sorry, I lost But she's saying that it has been come into force this year, in June this year. And then they say governments that have ratified this convention will be required to put in place the necessary laws and policy measures to prevent and address violence and harassment in the world of work. So I don't know. Yeah, there is also a question from ECLAC. I would like, this was a comment, but this is a question. I would like to ask about the role of the interviewer in violence-based on surveys. Is there any recommendation or manual in terms of what the interviewer should do if a situation of violence is noticed? Maybe Claudia, this is for you.
Thank you. And I don't remember if this is addressed in the guidelines as well, but yes, I mean, several things. First is that we do emphasize in the training that the training of interviewers is very important, and over and above the usual training that one would do on how to implement surveys and how to ask the questions, the safety and ethical recommendations around, how do you deal with the distress, or if you identify, for example, that a child is being abused. Yeah, you need to be aware of what are the mandatory reporting, regulations in the country. You need to inform women about, the limits of confidentiality while guaranteeing confidentiality and those kind of things. And usually we recommend that prior to implementing a survey, you should have established a relationship with some service organizations that are able to provide services in situations where you might find that someone is in danger or is very distressed, or where they actively ask for help. We usually have most of our survey implementers prepare a short, a small little leaflet with addresses or phones. And you don't just give it to the woman because that may actually put her in danger, but you ask if it would be safe for her to keep it if she wants it. And if necessary, you give a referral information. So we have a whole set of guidelines for that, and also some strategies, for example, what to do if somebody walks in the room. If the partner or an older child walks into the room when you're in the middle of an interview, you can change the subject, you can do certain things. So I'm happy to share with you the guidelines, and we are in the process of updating them precisely to address some of the issues that have come up around new forms of collecting data more through electronic means, and Zooms and WhatsApps and all kinds of things that are being used by people. So yeah, happy to share that with you. I'll put a link in the chat.
Yeah, in the chat. Thank you. I'm going to follow on the question that actually I start when I all of a sudden changed my screen. The issue of the convention, and I think there's an interesting question from Margie, and wonder who of you would like to take it. What are the gender data and statistics that would inform and monitor policy advocacy and policy responses on gender-based violence and harassment? I would twist it also in the workplace, because again, I think a lot of the methodology initially focus on domestic violence. So do you want to comment also on the measures in the actually workplace? Any of you wants to jump in? Otherwise, I call for volunteers. Marjut, do you do anything in Statistics Finland?
Could you please repeat, because the text is so small that I can't read it. So
basically, she's asking if there are gender data and statistics that would inform and monitor policy advocacy and policy responses on gender-based violence and harassment. And I add in the workplace, because the convention she has been mentioning in the chat is about the workplace.
Yeah, this is. I can't give an answer right away. I need to think about a bit. So, of course, we are monitoring, and we have systems and national laws for this, but maybe if
Okay.
Eva is still around, she can come.
Yes, I don't
to
know.
join.
Ola, do you want to comment on this in the survey that you had? Did you include also violence in the workplace?
We did it actually separately, and we did it more than one round. And also, it was really very much different from the household survey. And even the tools were different. And I may add for the interviewers' tools, I would like also to add that we brought to the training of interviewer psychiatrists, because it was very important how to enter the house from the interviewer perspective, and how he can make sure that in front of him or her actually can give the trust to the interviewer. So it's not easy, because the indicators are really very, very sensitive. And as Claudia also mentioned, sometimes a member from the household just come and join, and how they can actually tackle this issue. Especially also in our culture, sometimes, you have extended families, so anyone can come and join, so that's really very important. And the other issue, when it comes, for example, to very sensitive questions about sexual violence and other perspectives, as I mentioned, we dealt with cards, and the cards, so it wasn't actually, the question was on the card, and even the answers option also were on the card. So it made it really very helpful. So this is where we are, but I still see lots of space for development in the household surveys and in the workplace violence survey. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola.
Can I still add something? Because I noticed that, of course, we have questions on violence at workplaces in different surveys. Yeah, we have, for example, in the quality of work life survey, and so yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Sorry, I didn't
that's
understand
fine. That's
exactly
fine.
the question.
No problem. But that's why it's nice to have a conversation. And now there's another question, again, very interesting on, and I think there is picking up on a point, Ola, that you made earlier on the issue of communication and the importance of really linking with the policy making, with those that can make a difference. Can you think about an example where the data, the research you have done has changed a policy, has made a difference in the policy? And you want to try, Kathy?
Not just myself, but I think the evaluation work on mandatory arrest and pro-arrest policies is really game-changing in terms of how police agencies across the United States and other first world nations have addressed domestic violence and taken it out of the hands of a private domain and moved it to the public sphere. So I think that's probably one of the better examples of how researchers have partnered and really dramatically within a short period of time. In my own work, I've looked at evaluation of intensive enforcement of no contact orders. And that led to permanent changes in the district, the jurisdiction we were working on, in terms of how the police help and facilitate victim safety when perpetrators are released from jail after lockup.
Claudia?
Yeah, I can give a couple of examples from our early study in Thailand. It coincided, the data findings coincided with a discussion of a domestic violence bill in the parliament, which did not include marital rape. And we were able to convince the lawmakers through the data that this was a big issue in Thailand, and that led to marital rape being included in the law, in the domestic violence bill. And I think the other area where we've seen a lot of change is how the research has helped to influence training of healthcare providers, particularly doctors and nurses who, you know, some years back would say things like, oh, but I never see any women with, you know, that experience violence in my practice, or, you know, and I think that the data has been very useful in terms of highlighting why the healthcare sector needs to be engaged. So yeah, I mean, there's other examples, but I think the data is very powerful. And I'll give one example, which is from a study that Mary Ellsberg did in Nicaragua many years ago, where the law only punished if the incident led to injuries that were visible or that were, you know, caused an injury that lasted for more than 15 days. And through their survey, they were able to show how men adjusted their behavior to fit with the law. So they would hit in the abdomen or places where it wouldn't be visible, and that helped to change the law around, you know, what constituted.
Thank you. That's interesting. Yeah, indeed. And so it's also a message of hope. So what we do when talking about data, etc., you know, we change also the way, and hopefully we prevent a lot of violence. We have only 10 minutes, so I would like to ask you, each of you, really no more than 2 minutes, because otherwise, if you do it longer, you don't give space to the others. So I really would like to ask you to respect the maximum 2 minutes. The last one, if you have to think, and if you have all the money of the world, all the people that you may want, all the capacity you want, where do you think the international community should put the effort to improve international standards or international efforts? And I also wanted to give you a footnote on that question, if any of you want to comment. Very often we have focus on collecting data on women, on the victims. Should we also think about collecting more data on the men perspective, on the perpetrators, to understand really and to prevent and to work more with men? So we start with the last, I think, that spoke, that was Ola, and then we go around with Ola. 2 minutes, no more.
Thank you. I agree with you, Angela, and I may say that we started our first round on violence survey against women, and then we developed the survey, and it became violence in the society. So it covered women, the married, unmarried, girls, children, and also men, the married and unmarried men, and youth men too, and boys. So it's really important, because violence it is important to focus on women, and but it's really important also to focus on the society if we want just to make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola. Marjut, your last wisdom.
Thank you. I think it's very important. We need a men's perspective as well, as victims and perpetrators. As Eva told, that previous studies have indicated that men face more violence, but mostly by other men, and women face it mostly by men and partners. And in Finland, we decided to include also men in our ongoing survey, and we had quite a common understanding about it in our expert group. And we also need to understand the reasons behind the violative incidences, and also men's experiences during childhood, for example. We also, in the larger picture, we need to include boys and women to the work to prevent violence and understanding. And then I want to mention that we are, for example, there is coming a seminar on the impacts of the corona crisis on boys and men in Finland, and it's in next month. So yeah, but I still want to point out that let's not forget gender diversity and intersectionality. Those are very important, and let's leave no one behind. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Kathy.
Yeah, so I think it's incredibly important that we expand who we view as both victims and perpetrators, but also fully explore the mutuality of violence that might be occurring in intimate relationships. We have not done the best job in measuring violence in LGBTQ plus relationships. And I think we need to do much more work in that area. Now, I will point out when it comes to male perpetrated violence against women, we need to ensure the safety of women if we are going to collect data in dyad or couple-based samples. That's an incredibly potentially dangerous situation, because then the male perpetrator becomes very well aware that his partner is being asked the same question. And then the other part to it was, like, if you had unlimited amounts of money, I think it's incredibly important that we acknowledge the value of big data. I know we didn't have time to get to this, but there are opportunities for us to partner with computer science in terms of web scraping, but also online data sources. So web scraping of online police reports are a great opportunity for us to build out big data and to look at trends that might not otherwise be available to us. And that's an expensive endeavor, and one that goes back to my point about team science.
Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you. And just glad that Kathy already raised the safety issue. I think we need to understand the drivers and the risk factors for both perpetration and for experiencing abuse, but we need to do it in a very careful way. What I'm seeing is, firstly, that either men and women are being done in the same survey, which raises safety issues, as Kathy mentioned, or that the same questions that were designed for women on the basis of what they experience are being used for men, which also, I think, does not reflect the realities that Margit mentioned about the fact that they experience different forms of violence from different perpetrators. So a much more nuanced understanding of both. And I think for women, we've been good at getting the prevalence data, which has been very useful for advocacy, for putting the issue on the agenda, which was necessary. But I think we need to get much more nuanced around, you mentioned already, frequency, different kinds of perpetrators, the overlaps of different forms of partner violence, for example, and then reaching all those groups that experience multiple forms of discrimination, including LGBT, but also others, Indigenous women, linked to migration status, as we heard from Isabel, et cetera, et cetera. So really getting more into and more sub-national analysis, because we're still very much at the level of the national data, but understanding more, sub-national determinants at sub-national and even small area levels. That was also, I think, a next stage of where we need to go to.
Thank you, Claudia. So just to wrap up, and thank you really for the great suggestion and thoughts and inspiration that you have provided. So if I just, to UNSD, I think from at least this panel, I would say in terms of what do we need at international level, so without thinking about the resources that might need it and the political will to do it, I think clearly what I see is that the work on methodology on violence against women survey is not finished in terms of looking at also the measure of specific type of violence, particularly the one on cybercrime, related to cybercrime, but not only. And also more is also needing the granularity of information in terms of also victims and perpetrators. There's not just a group of men and a group of women, but there's the diversification, and we need to be more granular in also understanding the differences and the gender diversity, etc. So the other thing is clearly, again, yeah, Kat, indeed, it's a pity that we didn't have the time to go through, but big data is a great opportunity. So it's something that really would be great to explore in a way that this become an international common good. You know, we all experiment. We're also experimenting here at UNODC with web scraping to looking at this, and I'm sure at the university you are doing the same in our organization. So how can we do it in a way that we can learn from what we're doing without having everyone to just reinvent and doing the same thing and develop the same models to do the web scraping, for example. Another area that really we thought there's a lot that needs, particularly in terms of, and I've seen in the chat, people that ask, please share your experience with communication, with partnerships. And because clearly, and I think some of you from, you know, Ola, Marjorie, you said from the statistical office, we need to be more proactive, also as a statistician, to go out and so to make the difference, so to make sure that the data are actually used. And then I give my last 2 cents on what, and a little bit came out, but I think one of the things that I really see the need is more to talk about a national statistical system on violence against women. And as we have in all other topics that we look, and in all other crime, by the way, not only violence against women, is that there is no one source that tells the whole story. And so as well, it's only when we triangulate, when we put together all information that we can really understand how to, you know, the real phenomena. And that's where I miss really some international standard on, and particularly in my field where I work on, particularly on criminal justice, but how we think about more holistically about this system. And the last thing, again, in terms of international standard that I think came out at the end is that we need standards on and understanding on how to collect data from men about violence against women. With all the caveats that you said, we don't want to go into unethical or something that would not particularly be useful. So I think that, again, is an area where as an international community, probably we need to do more. So with this, is 1 minute left. So thank you very much to really the panelists and also to the audience and the chat and the questions that you put. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, and big applause to all of you. I really enjoyed and learned a lot just by listening to the panelists and to you, Angela, for the fantastic as a fantastic moderator for the session. We took note of the summary, of course, and of all the good points that the speakers made. I'm just taking the floor to tell our audience to remind you that we have another session to go. The last one is session 6. We will start promptly at 2 p.m. New York time. So I would like to ask you to please try to log in 10 minutes before. So we will start at 2 with our next session that will focus on what's next, paving the way forward for gender statistics. So we'll also have a fantastic group of speakers and we really hope you will all be able to stay with us. We see you in a few hours and thank you again to this fantastic panelists. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.